For many teenagers growing up in the 1970s, a paper route was thought to be one of the safest, quickest, and easiest ways to earn some extra cash. One young boy living in West Midlands of the UK, however, found out the hard way that it isn't always the case. Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we take a look at the case of Carl Bridgewater, a 13-year-old boy who was brutally murdered with a shotgun while out on his paper round. You may be wondering what a 13-year-old boy, innocently delivering papers around his hometown of Stourbridge, could have done to receive such a gruesome punishment. Well, today's story is one of speculation, conspiracy, injustice, and a death that still haunts the community to this very day. Carl Bridgewater was like any other regular boy growing up in the UK during the 1970s. He enjoyed music, going fishing, and attending the Scouts. Carl's father described him as a lovely lad who was always cheerful and helpful. These characteristics made Carl the perfect candidate for being a paperboy, as he came in contact with many customers who often complimented him on his cheerful demeanor and the way he would go out of his way to help them. One household that Carl grew close with lived at Yew Tree Farm. Because they were elderly, Carl was asked if he would mind taking the paper inside for them, a request the young boy was more than happy to do. On the day of his murder, on September 19th, 1978, Carl's mother Janet had taken her 3 children, Carl, Jane, and Philip, to the dentist for a checkup. Carl, being the dedicated paperboy he was, didn't wait around for a lift back home as he didn't want to be late for his paper round. Grabbing his stack of papers, Carl shot off to deliver them. Eventually, he reached Yew Tree Farm, which was located in a remote area off a main road, to bring elderly cousins Mary Poole and Fred Jones their daily news updates. Carl had done this countless times before, but this time things were different. When Carl entered the house, he realized that the pair were not home. To the boy's horror, however, he discovered that he was not alone in the house. Now, the details of what actually went on in that farmhouse may never be truly known, as those involved have changed their stories many times. What we do know, however, is that the 13-year-old boy came face to face with a man called Bert Spencer, who had broken in to steal the antiques of the home. It is believed that Bert either suspected Carl of recognizing him or didn't want the boy to identify him later down the road. In a flash decision, Bert pushed the boy into the living room of the house, pressed the gun to his head, and pulled the trigger. Carl was later discovered after the elderly cousins returned, kicking off a huge manhunt and media frenzy that the people of Stourbridge had never seen before. Around this time, Janet Bridgewater had cooked dinner for her family with one member missing from the table, Carl. After an hour passed, there was a knock on the front door. Janet's heart dropped when she saw police officers at her front door, suspecting that he must have been in an accident from falling off his bike, which resulted in him being sent to the hospital. The truth, as you know, was far more horrific. As the family tried to make sense of the shocking news they had just received, a flood of journalists and TV cameras appeared in front of the house. The gang of reporters didn't leave for days, desperately trying to get an interview or the inside scoop. They were so desperate, in fact, that the family had to turn up the volume of their TV set, as sneaky reporters were trying to record conversations through the letterbox and the closed windows. The once happy home had been shook violently at its foundation and had become a media circus. But as the Bridgewaters were about to find out, the media's appetite for answers was about to be satisfied as Carl's shotgun-wielding killer wasted no time in striking again. A name that had come up time and again in relation to the murder was Bert Spencer. The reason for this was because on the day of the murder, Spencer was seen driving his blue Vauxhall Viva near Yew Tree Farm. The witness also mentioned that the man driving the car was wearing an ambulance driver's uniform, the profession of the part-time burglar. What was even more damning for Bert Spencer was that he owned a firearm license for a, yep, you guessed it, shotgun. Unbelievably, Bert Spencer was released and dropped from police inquiries as 4 men were arrested for the killing of Carl Bridgewater, a group that would go on to be dubbed the Bridgewater Four. This group consisted of Patrick Malloy, James Robinson, and cousins Michael and Vincent Hickey, all men who took part in some seriously nasty robberies during 1978. It was after Malloy was the first to be arrested for a supermarket armed robbery that he admitted he had been upstairs in the yew tree farm on the night of Carl's murder. In the interview, Malloy explained how he had been stealing antiques when he heard a gunshot ring out from downstairs. Shortly after, the rest of his merry ragtag gang were arrested. James Robinson and Vincent Hickey were both sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years, keeping them behind bars until at least 2004. Michael Hickey, however, was told he would spend the rest of his life behind bars without any chance of walking free. Patrick Malloy received a 12-year prison sentence on a manslaughter charge, but he died of a heart attack in prison just 2 years after being handed the sentence. At this point, the police thought they had the case closed. That is, until a short time later, when a 74-year-old man called Hubert Wilkes was shot dead with a shotgun while sitting on his sofa. The murder happened during a Christmas party the pensioner was hosting at his home at Holloway Farm, located close to Yew Tree Farm. Who was the killer, you may ask? Wilkes' good friend, Bert Spencer. After shooting the man, Bert hit his wife Janet with the sawn-off shotgun, splitting her head open, and punched Mr. Wilkes' daughter, Jean, in the face. When questioned about this incident, Bert said that the steroids he had been taking must have mixed with alcohol to spark the violent rage. For the murder, Spencer received a life sentence, ultimately serving 15 years before being released in 1995 on parole. Despite the Bridgewater Four still serving time for the murder of Carl, people within the media began connecting the dots and suspected the shotgun killer, Bert Spencer, of brutally ending the life of a child. Bert had been a uniformed ambulance driver for the Corbett Hospital in Stourbridge. Now, Bert only lived 5 houses away from Carl, which supported the theory that the boy was killed because he recognized him and would serve as a definite witness. It's crazy to think that despite all the mounting evidence, Bert was dropped from the investigation just because the Bridgewater Four were arrested for the crime and the case was closed. You know, the whole owning a shotgun and being spotted at the farm on the day of the murder, to me, that would be a kind of giveaway. So why was Bert never interviewed further? Well, because of an iron-tight alibi from one of his co-workers saying that it was impossible for Spencer to have slipped away at the time of the murder. This, along with Patrick Malloy's account that he was robbing the Yew Tree Farm and heard the gunshot that killed Carl, meant that it must have been Malloy and his gang who were responsible. After years of speculation that the Bridgewater Four were innocent of Carl's murder, on February 21st, 1997, the men's convictions were overturned after a successful appeal. The reason for this was because the courts believed that the original trial was unfair and that parts of the evidence used were fabricated by police to force Patrick Malloy into making a fake confession about being at Yew Tree Farm and hearing the gunshot. That's just awful. During the original case, Vincent Hickey, another of the Bridgewater Four, had also admitted to being at the farm at the time of the murder. Another detail speculated to be a forced confession from the police. Unfortunately for Patrick Malloy, he never lived long enough to see himself absolved of the murder, passing away years earlier while behind bars. Stepping outside of the confinement of prison for the first time in almost 20 years, Michael Hickey said, "My conviction has been squashed, so I am absolved, and as far as I am concerned, that's the end of it." Personally, I don't think I would have been that nice about it, but let's not forget that these men were no angels either, and definitely deserved time behind bars for the armed robberies, one of which saw the gang take off with $200,000 of guns after hitting an elderly homeowner. In fact, after decades of incarceration, one of the members decided that he didn't mind doing a few extra years behind bars. In 2018, Michael Hickey decided to rob the house of a mother with a young family. His plan was to ring the doorbell and then run around and gently prise the window open with a piece of wood. Unfortunately for the thief, he accidentally smashed a pane of glass in the process. The terrified mother rushed into the room the noise had come from to see a man running away from the house. Although Hickey was wrongly accused in the Bridgewater case, there was no arguing with the modern-day technology like CCTV. The stunt landed him with a 9-month jail sentence, which was suspended for 2 years. While in court, Hickey was reminded of his 17 convictions for 28 offenses for burglary dating back before the Carl Bridgewater murder. The campaign to free and absolve the 4 men was led by Michael Hickey's mother, Anne Whalen, and campaigning journalist Paul Foote. Preparations were made for a case against 4 police officers in the Staffordshire Force on charges of fabricating evidence, but the case was dropped in December 1998. Strangely, in 2016, the missing memoirs of Bert Spencer appeared in a skip alongside a book written by Paul Foote called Murder at the Farm: Who Killed Carl Bridgewater? Interestingly, in that copy of the book, the handwriting of Paul Foote simply saying, "I think you did it," as this was found with Bert's memoirs. It insinuates that the journalist believed Spencer killed Carl. With the Bridgewater 4 now found innocent of Carl's murder, and Spencer looking more guilty than ever, the outcome should have been obvious, right? Bert Spencer was kept in prison for the rest of his days. Well, sadly for the Bridgewater family, the alleged killer was tried for the murder and is still a free man to this day. This means that Carl Bridgewater's murder is technically an unsolved murder, despite so many men being locked behind bars and a clear suspect in sight. In 2016, a documentary was made about the killing of Carl Bridgewater, in which Spencer was interviewed by the true crime author Simon W. Golding. Although Spencer comes across as a sweet, innocent man who is accused of something awful throughout the documentary, it comes to light that his co-worker's alibi wasn't as iron-tight as once believed, and that his own daughter suspected that he was responsible for the murder, as after that day in 1979, she said something had killed him inside. If anything was to crush the spirit of a person, it would be shooting a young boy at point blank with a shotgun. In the same documentary, Spencer's ex-wife explained that the day after Carl's murder, Bert had said that he was going to dispose of his shotgun, something he obviously didn't do, as he used it to kill his so-called friend, Hubert Wilkes. So, why was Wilkes really killed? Well, according to Spencer's daughter, Wilkes often discussed robberies with her father. It is speculated that Wilkes could have been with Spencer on the day of the Yew Tree Farm robbery, and that Bert felt that he had to silence the old man before he spilled the beans about the murder. This, of course, is a theory that Bert denies, claiming that it was just an argument that got out of hand. The sad truth is, the case of Carl Bridgewater remains unsolved, despite all the theories that it was Bert Spencer who pulled the trigger at Yew Tree Farm. For an innocent 13-year-old boy to lose his life in such a cruel way, with the murderer not serving time for the gruesome crime, it can only be considered one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in the UK history. For years, it was the alibi of Bert's coworker that kept him safe. But after the alibi unraveled, why wasn't the investigation picked back up? Bert Spencer is still alive and a free man today, often protesting his innocence in newspapers and interviews. Here on Twisted Minds, it's weird not to know exactly who was responsible for a murder, especially one of a 13-year-old boy. It must be so frustrating and unfair to those closest to the case that, after 40 years, only 2 people will ever know for sure what really happened at Yew Tree Farm: Carl and the monster behind the shotgun. If you would like to learn more about killers and the depths of evil they reach, check out one of the other videos appearing on your screen right now.